Church? Hell no. Are you no longer feeling comfortable in church? This podcast is for individuals who are desperately missing God, but don't know how to find Him. Substance abuse, domestic violence, sex offenses, acrimonious divorce can contribute to discomfort in the church. For these individuals, church is just not an option anymore. Ordained minister Dennis Hall and his guests invite you to listen to this podcast for topics that are inspiring, uplifting, and will bring hope to those who just feel church is not relevant in their lives today.
Hello, I'm Dr. Dennis Hall, and I am delighted that you're listening to this podcast today. You know, it seems like every week something in politics grabs my attention. And at the top of this podcast, I want to make sure you understand that I am not a medical doctor. My doctoral work is in theology and Christian apologetics. But today we're going to be talking about a medical procedure that I think anyone can go on the internet and explore and understand this procedure. It was just a few days ago that the Southern Baptist Convention, the nation's largest and arguably the most politically powerful Protestant denomination, met in Indianapolis. And during this meeting, they voted to oppose something called in vitro fertilization. Then I read a news story about how Democrats in Washington were attempting to push legislation to protect in vitro fertilization, apparently trying to put pressure on the Republican Party that proclaims to be pro-life. And so that's where it got interesting for me. It says, what in the world's going on? You know, there are nearly 13 million Southern Baptists across 45,000 churches in America. And there were 11,000 messengers, or we would think of them as delegates, to their annual meeting where they adopted a resolution that declares that in vitro fertilization creates the destruction of embryonic human life. And then the resolution, although it's non-binding, calls on Southern Baptists to adopt and only utilize reproductive technologies that affirm the unconditional value in the right to life of every human being. In other words, the Southern Baptists were saying that they are opposed to this procedure in vitro fertilization. Now, at this point, it might be good for us to just pause here and stop and talk about, how in vitro fertilization takes place and what it is. In vitro fertilization, commonly abbreviated IVF, is a procedure that's the process of joining a woman's egg and a husband's sperm in a lab rather than inside a woman's body. The Latin phrase in vitro means in glass. When the egg is fertilized by the sperm, the result is a living embryo, which is implanted in the woman's womb so that it can develop like any other baby. People seek in vitro fertilization when infertility problems are preventing a pregnancy. I've known many couples over the years who have sought this. It's often when one partner has an existing health condition. Frequently they seek IVF after other fertility methods have failed, or if they're at an advanced maternal age. It also becomes a reproductive option for same-sex couples or even single people who wish to have a baby without a partner. That may be a whole different discussion at some time, but some of the health problems that cause infertility are things like blocked fallopian tubes, or a condition called endometriosis, or low sperm counts, or sperm impairments. Various medical conditions involving the ovaries, or problems with the uterus, or even the possibility of passing on a genetic disease or disorder. In 1978, 46 years ago, Louise Brown was born and was referred to as the world's first test tube baby. Since that time, more than 8 million babies have been born as a result of vitro fertilization around the world. Here in the United States, about 2% of births, or about 90,000 babies per year, are born as a result of IVF. Fertility experts tell us that only about 5% of couples with infertility will seek in vitro fertilization. This IVF process basically involves having a healthcare provider use ultrasound to guide a needle into a woman's ovaries. The needle is connected to a suction device to pull eggs out of each follicle. And then the eggs are placed in a dish containing a special solution, and then the dish is placed in an incubator. And then later in the day, usually, an embryologist will try and fertilize all the mature eggs by injecting sperm. On average, only about 50%, that's an important number, only about 50% of the fertilized embryos will progress to a stage suitable to be transferred into a woman's uterus. Now, embryo transfer is really a simple procedure. It doesn't require anesthesia, and the embryos are injected into the uterus through a catheter. Now, for me, one of the most critical understandings is that pregnancy, listen to me, pregnancy does not occur until the embryo implants itself into the lining of the uterus. Sometimes this can take several days. It's also interesting to note that the IVF, in vitro fertilization, success rate is less than 50%. Embryo, fetus, and newborn baby are all just medical biological terms. An embryo is the name we use in the beginning of development, up to about 11 weeks in pregnancy. Then when it's more developed, we call it a fetus. And when it breathes on its own outside the female body, we call it a baby. Now, perhaps this current debate regarding in vitro fertilization was triggered when in February of this year, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that embryos in a laboratory should be considered children under state law. There was a lawsuit that was going on where some embryos were destroyed accidentally in a lab, and so they wanted to bring a lawsuit against this lab for the destruction of life. And immediately, all the healthcare providers providing in vitro fertilization in Alabama shut down, ceased to operate. They said they could not stand the liability if embryos were destroyed. What happened? Weeks later, the Alabama government passed a law to exempt these IVF providers from criminal prosecution, allowing them to reopen. So which is it? Which is it? Are embryos in a freezer in a lab the same as a fetus in a mother? Think about it this way. If a mother becomes pregnant and does nothing and there's no miscarriage, a baby will be born. If you have an embryo in a dish or in a freezer in a laboratory and you do nothing, there will never be a baby. They will never be a baby. Now, I am as pro-life and as opposed to abortion as anyone can be. However, it occurs to me that the potential of embryos in a laboratory to become babies is dependent on a multiple number of steps. They have to continue to develop. They have to be implanted in the uterus. The uterus has to accept them. Pregnancy has to develop. Anything can go wrong along the way in all these steps. You have to think of these embryos in a lab as children, the same way we think about fetuses and newborns. Seems to me that it's just going way too far in understanding the concept of what a child is, according to the Gallup poll, 82% of Americans feel that in vitro fertilization is morally acceptable. Morally acceptable. However, the same poll reveals that Americans are concerned. They're concerned about the destruction of human embryos created through the in vitro fertilization process. And one of the first documents that a patient signs when they begin to start the in vitro fertilization process asks them what they would like to do with the extra embryos, if they have any. The options generally include disposing of them, donating them to science, giving them to another patient, or keeping them in storage for a fee, of course. It's not inexpensive to just keep embryos in storage. Deciding what to do with the embryos that might be extra, might not be needed in the process, is a surprisingly emotional and even morally thorny for those who are not religious or who support reproductive autonomy. They may still feel a sense of responsibility for their embryos. A recent article in the Atlantic magazine, it was revealed that some patients are turning to a lesser-known alternative called compassionate transfer. Now, this procedure it's essentially an elaborate form of medical make-believe in which clinicians place a spare embryo in a patient's body at a time in the menstrual cycle when she is unlikely to get pregnant. In other words, they create a situation where the embryo is destined to fail and naturally flush out. This simply reflects the intense relationship that some patients have with the extra embryos that are produced in this process and the lengths that they're willing to go to make peace with their disposal. The writer of this article said that what many women desire and struggle to find is a way to relinquish the embryos that reflects their significance. Embryologists around the world are finding that a significant number of patients are desiring some kind of a ceremony for the disposal of their embryos, which might include reading a prayer or placing a prayer book near the incubator or blessing the embryos, or even singing a song to the embryos. Some centers even allow the embryos to be released to the couple for a burial. It's apparent that not all evangelical Christians agree on the moral acceptability of in vitro fertilization. Even some at the Southern Baptist Convention, some of the attendees spoke out, indicating that they're pro-life and that they feel like IVF, in vitro fertilization, is another way that we can be pro-life, believing that it's another way that God has given us to have children. Last year, Wayne Grudem, a distinguished theology professor at Phoenix Seminary, wrote an article about the morality of IVF. He makes the point that overcoming infertility is pleasing to God. Pleasing to God. Clearly it's been a source of deep sorrow for both men and women, but especially women throughout all human history. In the scripture, we find Sarah unable to bear children to Abraham for most of her life until she miraculously bore Isaac in her old age. And then, Jacob's wife, Rachel, she was unable to bear children for a long time after her marriage to Jacob, as was Samson's mother, the wife of Manoah. Hannah, the mother of Samuel, cried out to the Lord in deep sorrow because of her infertility in 1 Samuel 1, 2 through 18. And then in the New Testament, Zechariah and Elizabeth had no children because Elizabeth was barren, and both were advanced in years. But again, through God's miraculous intervention, Elizabeth eventually gave birth to John the Baptist. Now, these scriptural examples demonstrate that overcoming fertility is something that pleases God. Throughout the scripture, we read passages with the theme that children are a great blessing from God, as in Psalm 127:3, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb, a reward." The scripture gives us the understanding that as we seek to overcome infertility, that God is pleased with such efforts. Now, infertility was not part of God's original plan for creation. It's just yet another result of the fall in the Garden of Eden. Modern medicine is used to overcome many diseases and disabilities today. Now, we should view this as a good thing and as something for which we can thank God. When we think about today's medicines, we should be reminded that they're made from the resources found in the earth. And reflect on the fact that God commanded Adam and Eve to subdue the earth in Genesis 1:28. And then over in Luke 4:40, we get a glimpse of the healing of the ministry of Jesus when it says, "Now when the sun was setting, all those who had any who were sick with various diseases brought them to him, and he laid hands on every one of them and healed them." Now, do you think we could suppose that in this process that Jesus also healed the infertility of many women and men who had previously been unable to conceive and bear children? It just seems that it's morally right to support and welcome the advances in medicine that can bring health to people with various diseases and disabilities, including infertility. In this debate regarding the morality of in vitro fertilization, those who oppose IVF seem to take the position that an embryo frozen in a laboratory is a child. Now, as I alluded to earlier in this podcast, that embryo will never be a child if left alone, unlike a pregnant mother who will, when pregnant, unless a miscarriage occurs, have a baby. We must simply view an embryo sitting in a laboratory differently than an embryo living in a woman's uterus. When against all odds, an embryo that was produced in a laboratory attaches itself to a woman's uterus, it's at that point that the woman becomes pregnant. No sooner. It's at that point. It's at that point when we see the fruition of what David said to God in Psalms 39:13, when he said, "You knitted me together in my mother's womb." The embryo in the laboratory is not destined to grow into a little baby until God knits it into a mother's womb. I think this is the point when many theologians go astray. One of the troubling aspects of in vitro fertilization, it's a procedure that can be obtained by same-sex couples and singles. But I just got to tell you, there's no indication anywhere in Scripture that God ever considered it morally right for a child to be conceived by a man and woman who are not married to each other. Therefore, theologians and evangelical Christians, we should support regulations that impede in vitro fertilization being available to singles and same-sex couples. Now, as I begin to wind down this podcast, let me address some of the objections that have been raised about in vitro fertilization. First, there are those that contend that it's just not the natural process of conception of sexual intercourse that God intended. But I and others take the position that the knowledge and the skills and even the equipment necessary for in vitro fertilization are gifts to mankind. Do we consider it unnatural when a woman is receiving hormonal therapy to assist in becoming pregnant? Or do we consider it unnatural when a husband uses Viagra or a similar modern medicine to overcome erectile dysfunction so that he and his wife can have intercourse and conceive? All of these things are made from materials that God has placed in the natural world, and it's part of his gift to mankind. Or consider the medical process known as artificial insemination, using a husband's sperm. This procedure is simply enabling a wife to become pregnant by her husband when for some reason it's impossible for this to happen through ordinary sexual intercourse. When this procedure is successful, it allows a child to be conceived and born to a man and woman who are married to each other. And we don't consider that unnatural. So what is the problem? What is the problem with in vitro fertilization? Let me just tell you, there is no scripture that says conception must be the result of sexual intercourse. But there's abundant biblical testimony that teaches us about the blessings of children, the blessing of overcoming infertility, and the blessing of using God-given wisdom and resources to develop medical solutions for disease and disability, including infertility. One of the points of contention in this debate about the morality of in vitro fertilization is that some believe that embryo in the laboratory is human. And therefore, because IVF in most cases that there are extra embryos that must be disposed of, they're opposed. Now, in this podcast, I've tried to make the case that an embryo in a laboratory has no chance of becoming a baby until it's placed in the womb of one woman and attaches to the wall of her uterus. To me, it's just simply not rational to think of an embryo in a laboratory in the same way we think of an embryo in the womb of a woman. There's nothing. Again, there's just nothing in the scripture that suggests that we should view embryos frozen in a laboratory as human life. In fact, as I stated earlier, the scripture suggests to me that God views life beginning when he knits that embryo into the womb of a woman. Now, I want to be on record that I believe that in vitro fertilization can be viewed as a morally good choice for married couples struggling with infertility. it's a choice that brings the blessing of children to their family. Now, don't get me wrong, it's certainly important that embryos produced in laboratories be treated with dignity and respect. And it's apparent to me that we need more regulations to guide laboratories regarding the storage and disposal of embryos. But if you're listening to me today, if you know someone who was born as a result of in vitro fertilization, let them know that they are a creation of God as much as anybody else. And if you know someone who's considering in vitro fertilization as a tool to become pregnant, let them know that God does not have a problem with their choice. It's amazing to me the kinds of things that come to the surface as a result of political wrangling. Thanks for listening to this podcast today, and I hope that you'll be with us again in the future. May God bless you.